Hi, everybody, it's Jeff, and I'm making one of these videos about the this can be a linguistic topic specifically, and I'm going to explain what is a language. I see this question come up all the time on so many different discussion forums, fora or forums, whichever you want to call it, um, and I mean, for really, I've seen this for the past 25 years at least, and I've answered this question multiple times. What is language with regard to a dialect? Um, and that's kind of what I want to discuss here. And I'm going to discuss kind of the different levels of what we call language. And I want to, first start off in saying that there is not one single answer to this. And it really depends on your perspective of how you're coming at it. Are you coming at it from a technical linguistic perspective of phonology? That makes a difference, okay? It depends if you're coming at it from a dialectology point of view, which is pretty close to the technical linguistic perspective. Let's say dialectology and linguistics, and especially with regard to phonetics and phonology, is going to be one perspective, one angle at this whole question. Are you looking at this from kind of a language policy and planning perspective? That's going to be different. Are you looking at it from kind of a language survey perspective? That's going to be slightly different. Are you looking at it from a political point of view, politics? That's going to be a very different perspective. Are you looking at it from just a normal Joe, Jane walking down the street in, whatever community anywhere in the world, and it doesn't matter, that will be a different perspective. Are you looking at it from the perspective of a person that speaks a minority language? And I'm going to call it that because I don't know what to call it without getting myself shot in every direction. But I'm just going to say minority language versus major language. And I'm not trying to state any, bias or thing. I'm just trying to make a distinction between, the first, maybe the 5 to 10 languages in the world that are, recognized and get a lot of publications and all that versus the 6,000 other languages in the world. Okay, so I'm just trying to make a distinction between 5 to 10 and 6,000. It might be a little more than 10, but again, I'm not trying to make a quantitative approach. I'm just trying to make kind of a general qualitative difference of, and again, perspective here. I'm not trying to make any statements, and I'm going to try to explain these different perspectives without getting into too much detail, but I have to give some detail. Okay, so this is kind of important. So I've actually answered this question. If I really suggest that you go to proz.com, P-R-O-Z or Z.com, P-R-O-Z.com, and look in the forums. There's an area called forums, and just search on the word idiolect. Idiolect, okay? And that's I-D-I-O-L-E-C-T, idiolect. Just search on that, and you'll come up with my name. Okay? You'll find my name in there, in the list. There are a few people that have done it, but that's actually the word that's going to get you the closest to getting this. And I've made a few posts on the first page when you do the search across all of the forums, and I'm going to say forums because it's called forums in there, and we can call it for if you want to be really say, well, we need to use the Latin term for plural, for. Okay, fine. I just use forums, and that's what people understand, and it works pretty well. So if you go and look on proz.com, look in the forums, and just search on Idiolect, and then you'll find my name, Jeff Allen, and you'll see that I made a few posts on this. And I've described this. Now, I'm just going to describe it here right now in this place, kind of in a video format, because I see this just coming up so much. And people don't like to go read a long post. So I'll say that I want to, I've got a background in dialectology and in field linguistics and studying dialects and patois and dialects and all that, and working on major languages and working on minor languages and working on technologies about them and all that. So I've got to work on speech technologies, and having done, did my doctoral work on phonology of a Creole language, so pure linguistics point of view. And I've done technologies around that to actually deal with the speech part, and I've done linguistic analysis of languages, of grammar and semantics. So I mean, I've kind of got a good background in all this thing, and I just want to make that clear. I'm not talking from a point of view of one specific point of view, and I'm a sociolinguist as well, so I'll say that. And not just a theoretical linguist, and not just a phonologist, not just a phonetic science geek, but a sociolinguist. So I have a different perspective on that. And I think this kind of helps to show things. And I've worked on major languages and minor languages, so both, and I'm known for both. So that's why I can say that I'm able to kind of be able to address this question with enough knowledge that is not, that I can address it with an appropriate knowledge to be able to take different perspectives of this. Okay, so the first thing, I'll start with the proverb or the statement that is usually made that a language is a dialect with an army. Okay, this goes back a long time. I've heard this throughout my entire career, 40-ish years, or 35 plus years in doing language. I've heard that statement, and I haven't actually looked up and see who actually said it in the beginning, who quoted it. But this is kind of the statement. A language is a dialect is a dialect with an army. Now, what that means is not necessarily that you have to have a physical army. Is what you need to do is have power. Okay, so language is a dialect in power. Okay, that has been empowered by some way, and that can be. It's all about politics, okay? So, and this goes back centuries and centuries and centuries, and let's say millennia, okay? So whoever was in power, whether it be a king or a president or whatever, or a general of an army, they would decide what is the leading dominant dialect, and even local, we'll get down to it's really their local, maybe regional dialect, that is the one to be used. Okay, so it really comes down to that. And that's what that statement means. And so this is where really language is not an isolated thing that you can just say it's technically this, because it actually is completely interwoven with anything about politics, and actually about education, which includes politics. So this is all intertwined, and you can't separate these things. Okay, it's not possible to. It's not. We can separate it just to make a statement, but we can't separate it in order to make decisions on how these things, these vehicles of communication, whatever we want to call these things, are used, and why they're used and selected and chosen by people at certain points in time. Not everyone uses. So the second kind of thing I want to say is that not everyone uses a certain language, or maybe call them registers if we want. I'm trying to look for a word that it's going to be that kind of tries to cover these things. There have been many different attempts at trying to find a way to. Some people said vehicle of communication, actually, but register has a different meaning too. Sorry for the background noise, but I'm here in a restaurant, and that's where we are, and we're doing this. So, got better lighting, so that's why I do it around or at home. So, I've had comments about doing things at home, and people say it's too dark and stuff. So, do it in a restaurant. Great, got a little background noise. Okay, the back people are leaving now, so it's no big deal. So I'll use the word register. I don't like that. I don't like the word using vernacular either, because that has the problem is that any word we has different connotations, and that's why I wish I should make up a word. I should wake up, I should use the word smurf, actually. The word smurf. Okay, I think I've actually done this before and say, okay, the smurf this way and the smurf that. And that actually works because it has no meaning. It has just no meaning. I would like to invent a word that has no meaning to be able to, explain these levels. Smurf level 1, Smurf level 2, Smurf level 3. So let's go through this, okay? And I don't have this visually. Sorry, but I'm just going to do this with my hands. So, and there are posts about this on pros.com if you look at the Idiolect, because I describe these different levels. But I'll do it here in a more visual way without putting, I'm not going to make a PowerPoint and do this, okay? It just takes too much time to answer a lot of questions about all different things right now. I'm doing these videos. So the first thing I wanted to start with is we start with an idiolect. Okay, an idiolect is the individual way that you and I use sounds and formulation of sentences and words and a bit of meaning in a spoken form or a written form. Okay, I want to say that again, because I'm trying to avoid the words that we'd commonly use to categorize this. So it's the way that you or I as an individual person uses the sounds and the structure of a phrase, okay, that's both speech and text, and individual words and meaning to be able to, in a spoken or written form. And another way to say that some people will, prefers, it's the individual way that you or anyone uses phonological and syntactic or grammatical and lexical or terminological and semantic forms in their spoken form or written form. So both those actually mean the same thing, but I'm just saying two different ways. So I'm trying to avoid some of the certain meanings that these syntactic and grammar. Nothing is correct. We need to understand that nothing is correct here. It all depends. It all depends on the appropriateness of the environment, the context. So the idiolect is your way and my way. Now, that varies, doesn't it? Because even you and I, my own speech or my own grammar, sometimes I'll be writing a thing and I will mistake the there and the there and the there, okay? Sometimes I do that too, the it's and the it's, okay? I do that too. Or the spelling of the word too, T-O-O or T-W-O or 2-O. I will make that mistake even though I'm educated and I have my master's and doctorate degrees. And I have that. But sometimes there's a slip of it's not the slip of the tongue, it's the slip of the finger, okay, on the phone. And it happens. And then I'll reread it and go, oh no, okay. I'll do that if I, put that extra apostrophe in, okay? But we have slips of the finger, we have the slips of the tongue. And even when you're tired, sometimes when I'm tired, and have had a long day at work with 4 hours of commuting back and forth, I will just be more tired and my pronunciation won't be exactly the same as if I'm doing it in a different environment. If I'm speaking slowly, it's different than I'm speaking fast. And that changes how your sounds are, okay? And it depends on my context of where I'm writing things. If I am writing things in a comic book strip with a little bubble, I will write it differently than if I write the same thing in a journal paper or conference paper where I'm going to publish to, a specific journal that will be peer reviewed. There will be ways that I will use words differently, and the way that I write them will be used differently if it's in a comic book, okay? And this happens. This is just the reality of things. You can actually write things differently, and it's okay. And you can pronounce things differently, and it's okay. And you can write the way you pronounce things differently in different environments, and that's okay. Because those are different registers, okay? So you can have registers that are depending on your being tired and fatigued or if you're in a super fast talking today, I'm going to be saying things differently and writing things differently, okay? I'm doing that on purpose. You can have different registers depending on the environment that you're in, okay? So even an individual at the idiolect level can and will have different registers, okay? And those can be sociolects. That can be a sociolect. So a sociolect can, depending on the register you use, will be depending on the environment you use, depending on some social level. So maybe if I speak, if I'm going to speak at a conference with a bunch of, educated PhDs and masters, I will use certain words. Then if I go out in the street and talk with my friends down on, wherever, versus if I go into, and I'm talking any place, any street, so you can go to the streets that are, if I go, or if I use a certain ways in certain communities, I'll use my different words and I'll use different ways of saying things. You do it too, okay? So this is sociolect. And depending on the education level, the social level, the economic level of the people that I'm addressing, I will change my vocabulary, okay? Or the way that I say things, or the way I pronounce things, my accent or whatever, okay? That's a sociolect, even for the individual. So we have a mixture between idiolect, the individual level, and that's how the sociolect and the environments will actually impact how you speak, okay? At an individual level. So that's the individual level idiolect. Okay, with sociolect, I'm mentioning it. Now, when you begin to group a bunch of individual speakers together in a family, they'll all be using the same word for a thing to cook with that you put on the stove, and you put fish in, or it's going to fry the fish. Some people will have a way to say that, and in another family, maybe down the road, they might have a different word, right? And there'll be different words, okay? And usually what we'll find is that a group of families in a community, where a certain community where they've all kind of lived around for the same amounts of time. I'm not talking about communities where there's a lot of movement in and out. Okay, I'm talking about communities that are stable for a period of time. You will have what becomes in a community a town, a small town. Becomes what you call a patois. Okay, a patois is a group of these idiolects of individuals within families that have been there for a stable amount of time. They all begin to kind of use the same vocabulary and pronunciation styles and patterns, okay, that are similar. So that's called a patois. So that's a community, and it's up to a district. I mean, there's no physical boundary here. There's no actual real boundary. It's usually by boundaries of water and mountains and things. That happens. But usually it's kind of distance-based, okay? And this patois, which is what we call it in linguistics, represents a variety. The word I'm looking for is variety. The variety that you're using, okay? So it's not registered, it's a variety. The variety is the word I've been looking for. I've got it written here. I have used it, but I found it again here. That variety that's used by one community versus another community that is a certain amount of miles or kilometers away, depending on how the distance is and the time it takes to get there, or the difficulty it takes to get there. These are, so this patois can be easily identified by a number of very specific phonetic or phonological patterns. Okay. And I don't want to make the distinction between phonetic and phonological here, and I can, but I'm not going to try to get in, because if we do this, this video will become so long that no one will watch it. But I'm just going to kind of make this simple here. So this patois can be identified by a number of pronunciation patterns and lexical traits of use of specific words. Where I said the thing that you put in the stove to fry the fish and to fry a hamburger or whatever, the meat or whatever you want to put in there, or a wok, whatever, vegetables, whatever you put in that thing, people will use different words for it. Okay. Now I don't want to use the word because I want you to kind of guess at the different words for that. Okay. And that there are going to be so those specific words for the specific objects and in concepts, how they're used and grouped in patterns across within a community, and then compared to other communities down the road, it's going to determine if you're one patois or another patois. Okay. Now, when you begin to group these communities together in a region, okay, that very often has a boundary, a physical boundary with another region, and that boundary can usually be of a river or a lake or a or a mountain or a ravine, kind of going down, kind of like a canyon. So that will be a physical boundary that makes it difficult. It's a difficult thing to be able to get to the other side. That then separates one group of these patois, okay, and I'm going to say patois so you can hear the plural of this, which kind of, even if we don't like saying that, hey, that's what it is. I'm going to just try to do. So a group of these patois varieties, a group of them is called a dialect, okay, and it's usually a region, okay, and again, with often physical boundaries between these different regions. Now, these regions, I want to be careful, because regions, I'm not talking about administrative regions that a country decides this is a region. Usually this corresponds, but usually it doesn't always. So these are actual linguistic regions, okay, that are usually physical boundary based, okay, and that's why the traits are different. So again, this dialect has groups of similar pronunciation traits and word traits that are, and you can put this on an atlas. This is called a dialect atlas. This exists, okay? Dialect and dialect atlases, they are made, and they do trace the differences of those dialect atlases do trace the pronunciation traits, okay? And this is where the difference between, kind of where phonetic and phonology kind of come into play, but I want to kind of avoid that because it's a little bit more complex than that. And then the words that are chosen. And so when you do survey work on dialects, you're going to use certain words to be able to do your survey. And there are sets of words. There are a lot of dialect survey kind of work that are used around a 200 word list, usually, that are used to be able to go across different towns and villages and communities and islands and areas and regions or whatever, to be able to distinguish, to determine at what point those words are becoming different, okay, and at what point the pronunciation is becoming different from one region to another. And again, this is just observations. You make observations. You try to elicit the things and find out the differences. And at what point are they changing from one part of the spectrum to another point, to another point, to another point? Okay, this is a spectrum. And this is why I give an example of what is the difference between German, or little certain German, the German and Schweizerdeutsch is in different cantons in Switzerland, with different states in Germany, and then how is that different with Dutch, and then how is that different with Flemish in Belgium? Okay, and it kind of depends, because it depends on where you come from Germany into the Netherlands or into Belgium. Okay, so I'm kind of not trying to. I was kind of going from this point here, Switzerland, coming up to Germany, and coming across and coming into Belgium, into the Netherlands in parallel. But what are the differences between those? Well, they're just a spectrum, and things change. The pronunciation traits change, and they're changing constantly. And you have these patterns that you can actually put on a map. The same thing with what is the difference between Spanish. Okay, the difference between Spanish and Italian is not. Italian is where you speak Spanish with lots of gestures, okay, and you kind of do lots of gestures. That's kind of the joke. But what are these Romance languages? In English, we tend to call them, in linguistics, we tend to call them Romance languages. In Europe, we tend to call them Latin-based languages, okay, whatever. They're the same thing. But what is the difference between Spanish and Portuguese and Italian and French? And all the little these dialect things that are kind of within each of these regional varieties that are in each of these countries. What are these? Well, what happens is when you now take a dialect, okay, which is you can objectively describe this thing, okay, with maps, dialect atlas maps. based on these things I've discussed, pronunciation traits and word traits on a spectrum. But now when you begin to group these at a higher level, with some political administrative boundaries called a country or a nation, based that who might have a king or some leader of some type. Okay, so back in the Middle Ages, it may have been some tribal leader. Okay, and then that person became bigger tribes, and it became whatever we call this thing. Today we call these generals. So in today's army kind of vocabulary, but back then we had a I can't remember these words. I'm kind of looking for the words. I don't want to look for the words more than I'm doing it right now. So you weren't a serf. You were kind of the leader of the fief, and then the groups and bigger ones. It becomes bigger dukes and whatever these things are. Kind of these groups. Sorry for the noise again. Got kids in the background, but that's the way it is here. So so when you begin to group these into administrative boundaries of a nation or something of this type, a country or nation, which has its own administrative boundaries, which were not necessarily set up along at linguistic boundaries, but they're set up for some other reasons. Sometimes you will have, this will become what we call a language. Okay, so you can have, and the funny thing is that you can have overlapping between two neighboring countries. And in one country, they will call this, and then of course this is the dialect that happens over time. One leader's dialect becomes the one that is announced. Like in 1534 or 1531, it was French. François the Premier, so François the First, decided that we will no longer speak Latin, we will speak French. We're going to call this thing French, which is basically a derivative of Low Latin over time. Okay, and as was Spanish as well, and so were all these other languages, are all kind of derivatives of this Low Latin that was, kind of evolved in its own places and periods of time in different locations of these different dialect areas or patois, whatever these communities. So when one person says, "Now this is my language, this is the language I'm going to speak," well, in one country you may have where it's called a language, where it's been declared as a language, which is basically the dialect in power. Okay. But over in another neighboring country, it actually may not be the major regional variety that is recognized. It may be a minor one. And so over there it's called a dialect. Okay? Whereas really these are all dialects. They're all really just dialects. But it depends on who's in power, where, and to what you call it a language or not, or you call it a dialect. Okay? So that's one view of it. But you got to be careful because, like, if I go into southern France and I go to people that are in the Occitan kind of regional area, because there are three regional areas in France. You got Oil, you got Occitan, and you got Franco-Provençal. Okay, I actually don't know how to pronounce these in English because I learned them all in French, so I might be having a funny pronunciation. Forgive me for that. Okay, whatever. But in those three regional areas of what we call French, we also have outside of those the other dialects of other varieties that have been pushed away and kind of pushed off into their corners. But what you've got are, what we call a regional language. We sometimes call these regional languages, then we call them the regional dialects. And depending on how much importance they have and what is the value and recognition they get. And it really comes back down to value and recognition and perception. This is not any linguistic value. There's just no linguistic, value. It's just how it's perceived. So a lot of this comes down to it depends. And depends who you're talking to. So if I go into southern France, I go to someone that lives in the Occitan region, and I say to them that you speak a dialect, I will probably get myself killed. Okay? Because they're going to say, no, we speak a language, because that's a value perception. Now, but then if I go to some other place, I get some people in India that I've been talking to recently, and they will say, they'll say English is a language, Hindi is a language, but Bhojpuri is a dialect. Well, no, they're all the same thing, but it's all perspective of how you perceive these things, these varieties. So I don't want to go on. I've been going for 30 minutes here, kind of explain it. But what I really encourage you to know is that there is no such thing as a language. Language does not exist. It's a fake term to group things. It's just a pseudo term. It's just it's a pseudonym to grab it to explain something that has political power or it has been powered in some military or economic. Over time it became economically a trade variety that became more important and became the thing to use, um, or it had some other reasons that become in power. And things change. Language things actually different languages. We don't speak Latin anymore because it lost its power at a certain point in time and evolved into other things, which then got their own power, such as French had a certain amount of time that it was in power, and then and German had a time it was in power. And today in Spain actually had a time in power at certain points of time, and in history you can find out that certain wars and stuff caused the power to decline. Um, you know, within Europe and across the Atlantic to North America and the New World and all that, you can see all these different periods of time where these varieties became more important or less important. And today it's English, and then tomorrow, as one of my professors, Gilbert Puech, said, back in the 1990s in some of my classes, and I found it actually written in one of the scientific magazines. He says, in the next, the future centuries will be Japanese, and that'll be harder. So there are periods of time where these varieties come in power and they lose power, and then they get power again. And it depends on how easy are to understand. Or it's not about how easy a language is to learn that comes into play. That does in some things. It just comes down to how flexible it is to be able to be used as a trade variety by more people, and whoever is in power at a certain period of time to be able to promote that. That's all about communication and marketing. Okay, and again, all these can be economic, they can be military, they can have all kinds of different reasons here that this power has been put onto them. And